Aloha, everyone. Welcome to today's Building Power webinar. My name is Dania Hakim. I'm the Program Director for Hawaii Center for Food Safety. Today's Building Power webinar is called Pesticides in Paradise, the Frequently Asked Questions. And the plan for today is I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to the pesticide report and to the Frequently Asked Questions resource that we just released last week. And then Bill Freese, our science policy analyst, is going to go through some of those key frequently asked questions to give us really clear and concise answers to those. And then we'll have a Q&A to follow where you can ask some of your questions. And then hopefully be POW a little before 1 p.m. today. So the Pesticides in Paradise report was released May 2015, and it came out of a need from community members and decision makers to better understand the data around the pesticide seed industry in Hawaii, the experimental GE field crop operations, and the impact that they have on human health and the environment. We reviewed over 270 scientific and medical peer-reviewed studies and put together this incredible resource in all various forms, over a 100-page report to a 30-page report to a 2-page report and an animation and a bunch of other resources. So all that good stuff can be found on our website, hawaiicfs.org. The findings of the report were clear. The heavy pesticide use by the GE operations in Hawaii endanger the health of our people and of our environment and natural resources. So we were clear on that, and we wanted to get this information out to the communities across the island. So we've been doing these free presentations at anywhere that will have us. We've done presentations in a wide range of communities, over 1,000 people. As you can see on this map, we did presentations at Shriners Hospital with doctors and nurses. We've done them at the university. We've done them for middle schoolers and impacted community members at natural farming conventions, the lot. So if it's something you're interested in, or you know of someone that would be, please send them our way, and we're happy to do that presentation in whatever format makes sense for you. So the frequently asked questions came out of those presentations and also from conversations with our allies and partners. As you know, industry has a massive and well-funded PR machine, and they spread a lot of information and myths about the scope and the impact and the health implications of their operations across the islands. And so you can think of this resource as sort of a cheat sheet, a quick reference guide that will help you debunk some of those myths in a really clear and concise way. We have over 30 questions answered in this report, so take a look at it. The website is cfs.center/high pesticide FAQs, and that will be also at the, we'll have that link at the end of the presentation, and we'll send it to you following this webinar. So keep an eye out for that, share this information, and we'll be recording this webinar so you can share it with friends and family that weren't able to be here. So with that, I'll pass it off to Bill, who will get us going on the first question. Bill?
I think one important thing here is that 97% of the genetically engineered crop field trials on Hawaii were conducted by what we often call the Big Five. And these are the big multinational pesticide seed companies that most of you are familiar with: Monsanto, DuPont Pioneer, Syngenta, Dow, and BASF. And barely more than 1%, were conducted by public sector institutions like universities. And this is from 2010 to 2014. I think, more important than the numbers here is the important point that, biotech proponents, they love to discuss public sector research that sounds really good. They're going to have disease-resistant crops. They're going to do all of these wonderful things. And it's all to give the false impression that genetic engineering is some humanitarian enterprise. And I think what, these figures show, the overwhelming domination of this technology by the big pesticide companies is, tells us that that's not what it's about. And as we'll see, it has a lot more to do with increasing the use of pesticides and pesticide dependence. So one key thing is that when you grow, of course, the biggest, crop that the seed industry grows is genetically engineered corn, as I'm sure you all know. And our report contains lots of information and facts about how much pesticides are sprayed on it. I'm not going to go over all of those numbers now. I think that these quotes from James Brubaker, who some of you probably know, he's a famous corn breeder on Hawaii, kind of tells it all. He says straight out that, the corn seed industry in Hawaii uses pesticides heavily because the varieties they grow, they aren't adapted to Hawaii's pests and diseases. These are varieties that are being bred for use on the mainland. And just look at this, insecticide and fungicide treatments are applied every 5 to 7 days. That's incredibly intensive use of pesticides. Nothing like on the mainland. It's much more intensive. And not only insecticides and fungicides, but also herbicides are very heavily used. And a lot of the herbicide use comes from the industry's preferred, development. Their biggest area of development is herbicide-resistant crops. And that, as most of you know, these are crops that are specifically engineered to withstand direct spraying with, toxic herbicides like glyphosate, 2,4-D, and dicamba. And these crops have led to a huge increase in herbicide use on the mainland. And Hawaii is the place where a lot of these crops are first tested. Oh, one important point here, and this is an industry, I think sometimes they try to, confuse this point, but herbicides are one form of pesticide. Okay, so when we say genetically engineered crops are pesticide intensive, that includes the big increase in herbicide use with these herbicide resistant crops. So this is a chart that shows the number of field trial permits that involve different traits, that is different, characteristics that are conferred by genetic engineering. And as you can see, herbicide-resistant crops are hugely predominant here. This is the major application, the major kind of crop that the biotech industry is testing on Hawaii. And look, compare it to, for instance, disease resistance. Many fewer, and even fewer genetically engineered crops that are supposed to have, better nutrition. That's almost absent. There's hardly any research going on in this area. So I think an important point here is that, I know in Hawaii, the virus-resistant papaya looms very large as kind of a symbol of genetic engineering. But I would urge you, don't let discussions be framed around this papaya because it's a very unusual crop. By far the majority, over 80% of the world's genetically engineered crops, and that's by acreage, are herbicide resistant, okay? And again, that's also what's being primarily tested on Hawaii. So that's the real deal, and that's what we really need to talk about. Now, one, talking point that we often hear is that, today's pesticides are safe, right? Sometimes biotech proponents will even concede that, oh yeah, back in the days of, pineapple and, kind of plantation era agriculture on Hawaii with pineapples and sugarcane, yeah, some of those pesticides were bad news. Oh, but today everything's safe. Well, that's simply not true, all right? And the key resource for our report, all right, was a groundbreaking review by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Okay, this is the association that represents our nation's, pediatricians, right? And they did a report called Pesticide Exposure in Children. And they basically singled out, almost 200, they looked at over 200 medical studies, and they found strong evidence for 4 major types of harm from pesticides, and this is particularly in children. And I've listed them here. As you can see, childhood cancers, neurobehavioral deficits, adverse birth outcomes, and asthma. And I think an important point here is that, the industry often says, oh, EPA says this pesticide is safe, so why worry? I would just emphasize that medical science, independent medical scientists often come to very different conclusions than EPA. And who are we going to trust? Are we going to trust our nation's independent medical scientists, or are we going to trust our regulators, who we know are very heavily influenced by pesticide industry interests? And I'll come back to that a little more. One example is a class of insecticides called organophosphates. These are nervous system poisons that disrupt the brains of insects, or the nervous systems of insects. And not surprisingly, they also have adverse effects on neurodevelopment. And what we found is there's very strong research now showing that when pregnant women are exposed to these insecticides, and a big example is chlorpyrifos, which is very heavily used on Hawaii. The children that they bear, when you follow them for years, up to 7 or 8 years of age, you find that they have significantly poor mental development, developmental disorder, increased incidence of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and lower IQ. And a Harvard neurologist has actually estimated that exposure to these pesticides, these organophosphate insecticides, has cost U.S. children nearly 17 million IQ points collectively. This is, a real, of course, serious problem. Now, in 2015, EPA finally got around to proposing a ban on the use of the major organophosphate, chlorpyrifos. We don't know if this is going to happen. It's, at present, it's still being heavily used in Hawaii. Another, myth that we often hear is, very loose claims by biotech proponents that, say glyphosate, and glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup herbicides, is safe as salt. All right. Now, what is this based on? What are these claims based on? Well, what they're based on is a crude measure of what's called acute toxicity, known as lethal dose 50. Okay, so all that this means is that if you take a group of animals, say rats, and you feed them, the pesticide, say in this case glyphosate, and you find out how much it takes in a single dose to kill half of a group of these lab animals, say rats, all right? So it turns out that the LD50 value of glyphosate is similar to that of salt. That means it takes about as much glyphosate as it does of salt to kill an animal outright. But the thing is, this has almost no relevance to the real world, all right? People don't, pour salt down their throats. They don't drink from jugs of Roundup. In the real world, we're exposed to much lower amounts, but over long periods of time, all right? And those are the measures of toxicity that we really need to pay attention to. It's called, chronic toxicity. So what about exposure to glyphosate in the real world? Well, in 2015, the World Health Organization found that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic to humans. All right, and again, this is not drinking from jugs of Roundup. This is, exposure to glyphosate in real-world conditions. Now, they made this determination based on, glyphosate causing cancer in lab animals, but also studies of farmers that show that farmers exposed to glyphosate have a higher risk of a really nasty immune system cancer known as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. We have similar findings from other herbicides that are used heavily in Hawaii, 2,4-D and dicamba, for instance. There are lots of crops that are being engineered to withstand these herbicides as well as to glyphosate. They've also been linked to cancer, and in particular the same cancer. Other studies show that 2,4-D exposure is associated with Parkinson's disease as well as kidney disorders. And I could go on. There are other health impacts, but this just gives you a sense of what's really going on in the real world. Now, once again, as I mentioned before, biotech companies have sometimes the proponents will concede that past, plantation era pesticides were, hazardous, but since we're not using them anymore, there's no need to be concerned. Well, I think it's important to remember that at the time when these pesticides were used in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, these companies were saying they're safe, right? So we shouldn't have trusted them then, and certainly we cannot trust the similar claims about the safety of today's pesticides. Now, one question that comes up, or one talking point that I've seen industry use, is that if we increase regulation of pesticides, and in particular what are called restricted use pesticides, it will harm local farmers who are growing food. And this is, simply not the case. I mean, I guess first we should talk about what restricted use pesticides are. And it's basically a category that EPA has come up with for especially hazardous pesticides that require a special license to use. Atrazine is an example, chlorpyrifos, paraquat. Those are just a few examples. However, it's important to remember that many non-RUPs, that is general use pesticides, can also be hazardous, and glyphosate is one example. 2,4-D and dicamba are others. So, don't let yourself be fooled into thinking that RUPs are, the only thing that should concern us. On this whole point of who uses these RUPs, though, this is, and I apologize, this is a bit fuzzy, but these are figures from the state ag department. And you can see that large agricultural users, and this is mostly the seed pesticide companies, Monsanto and company, also Kauai coffee is included, and some of the few big plantation growers who are left, say for sugarcane growers, they use 99.8% of the RUPs on Hawaii, whereas small users use hardly any at all, just 0.2%. We're also often told by the industry that pesticides are very strictly regulated, so we really shouldn't worry about them. But the flaws in EPA regulation are many. And one of the big ones is that EPA demands tests really only on the active ingredient and not the full formulation. So what I've shown here in the picture is a jug of Roundup that many of you have probably seen. The active ingredient in Roundup is glyphosate, right? That's the chemical that actually kills the plant. However, there are lots of other ingredients in Roundup herbicide that you buy at the store. And these are called adjuvants and surfactants, and basically they help the active ingredient become better absorbed by the plant, for instance. And some of them are toxic in their own right, these additional ingredients, and others make the active ingredient more toxic. So it's really absurd that EPA is not demanding tests on the full formulations, because we know in many cases the formulations are more toxic than the active ingredient alone. Another big issue is that, of course, we're all exposed not just to one pesticide. There are many different pesticide, many different residues of pesticide, for instance, in our food, and we're exposed to multiple pesticides. So, you can't just say, that single testing of various active ingredients can, predict harms from exposure to multiple pesticides. Sometimes they can have additive or synergistic effects. Another really important point is that nearly all pesticide testing is conducted by industry. And I have seen EPA decision documents on pesticides where basically no independent science is cited at all, or very, very little. They really rely almost entirely on industry-conducted tests. And that's obviously a really big concern, since these companies have conflicts of interest. They want to see their products get approved. And we know that there's a lot of political pressure on EPA and also European regulators to approve these hazardous pesticides. And I've just given one example of this from a press release from a group that we work with, NRDC. So, there are many reasons not to trust EPA regulation. And again, as I said before, what medical scientists say is often very different from what you hear from EPA. One, real good example, I think, and a sad example is, I'm sure many of you saw that on Kauai, some Syngenta workers, actually 10 employees, were sent to the hospital because of exposure to chlorpyrifos and potentially other pesticides that were sprayed on a field. And this was, and this came just as the industry was trying to persuade us how careful the companies are in applying these pesticides. And, even Scott Enright, the head of the Department of Agriculture of Hawaii, says, oh, no one applies pesticides better or more safely than these, multinationals. And then here we see the truth, right? Syngenta workers sickened by toxic insecticides. We weren't told what their symptoms were, but we know that 10 were hospitalized. And about 10 months later, EPA actually sued Syngenta for nearly $5 million for 261 separate violations of federal law for this very episode. And so, all of this mythology about how careful these companies are, don't believe it. Here we have clear evidence that that's not the case. And of course, a real major concern of ours is pesticide drift, and I'm sure of yours too. And, in Kauai, I'm sure a lot of you know about the Waimea Canyon Middle School poisoning episodes from 2006, I believe, to 2008, several episodes. And, what was really shameful, I think, was that the University of Hawaii came out. They did a study about 4 or 5 years after, the latest episode. And they did a report, and they tried to divert attention to stinkweed. They were saying that this particular weed that emits organic compounds could well have been responsible for these, pesticide drift poisonings. And, these were kids who suffered, nausea, vomiting. Some of them had to, take, special drugs. This is a serious thing. We should not have, especially our children, exposed to these pesticides. So the Kauai Fact-Finding Group did a report that perhaps you've seen, the Joint Fact-Finding Commission, I believe it was called. And they basically got a report from a former EPA scientist who really debunked the stinkweed myth and said that these, poisoning episodes were far more likely related to pesticide exposures than to stinkweed, which is, of course, we knew all along. The pesticide drift episode is very serious in Hawaii, and it's actually serious in other states too, for instance, California. And in 2005, a group of 15 government scientists, this is from EPA as well as from state, regulatory agencies, they did a report on, kids being sickened by pesticides at schools, and they found that a lot of episodes had to do with drift from agricultural lands nearby. And they called positively for adoption of pesticide spray buffer zones around schools, right? And this is, of course, just what, many folks in Hawaii have been calling for, and what Bill 2491 would have assured us. So this is, not just, something that people are calling for in Hawaii, but this is, something that scientists, serious scientists have realized is necessary to protect our vulnerable children from pesticide exposure. And I would add that 14 California counties have enacted buffer zones around schools. Now, not all of these cover all pesticides or all times of the year, but it's at least a start, and they've taken at least a first step. One thing that often comes up is all of this hype about how important the pesticide seed industry is to Hawaii's economy. So, we decided to explore this, to what extent is this actually true? And I looked through, I can't tell you how many government reports of employment and economic impact of different industries. And what we found was that the seed industry represented just a bit over 0.2% of total Hawaii jobs. All right, so this is not a big employer in Hawaii. And a lot of these jobs, a significant portion of them, are even just part-time. The other thing is that the seed industry doesn't make a very large contribution to the state's economy. And what we find is that the seed industry is also, it controls an increasing share of Hawaii's prime farmland. And this chart, there's a lot going on here, but basically the line represents the amount of land that is harvested of seed crops by the seed industry, that is the big five companies. And as you can see, that land area has increased by tenfold since the early 1980s. And at the same time, you can see that the land planted to fruits and vegetables has decreased pretty dramatically. So, we're talking about, an increasing dominance of the seed industry in Hawaii and declining production of, stuff that, foods that people actually eat, vegetables and non-plantation fruits. The latest estimate I've seen, and this comes from Hawaii agricultural scientists, is that Hawaii now only supplies 12% of its food needs and imports 88%. Also, research by Hawaii agricultural scientists also shows that increased production of foods for local consumption would employ many times, nearly double to over 10 times the number of workers now employed by the seed industry. And this depends on how much of, Hawaii's food needs would be supplied by local production. But clearly, there could be much more employment if Hawaii were to move towards a more sustainable model of, producing more food for local consumption. And of course, this would also mean much bigger impacts on Hawaii's economy, much bigger contributions to Hawaii's economy. So that's a lot more in the report, but I've tried to hit some of the high points, and I guess I would be happy to, take any questions.
Great, thanks, Bill. So if you have a question, you can type it into the window in your control panel, and I will ask away. So go ahead and type that in if you have them. We'll save a few. I'll wait a few minutes. I have a quick question I could ask you, Bill. We often get the argument that there are other chemicals that are just as dangerous as pesticides. Can you, I know that's one of the FAQs, one of the questions in the FAQs, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is, one of those clever industry talking points. It's basically designed just to divert attention from the toxicity of pesticides that are being used. Of course, no one denies, we don't deny that there are other toxic chemicals, industrial chemicals that aren't used in agriculture. And to the extent that's true, that's bad. We should, address that as well. But that doesn't make, toxic pesticides okay. All right, that's ridiculous. So, don't let yourself be diverted by that. Center for Food Safety, our mission is to support sustainable agriculture, and so we focus on pesticides. Naturally, those are the toxic compounds that are used in agriculture. So that's what we focus on. So, again, clearly the evidence is overwhelming that a lot of the pesticides used on Hawaii really are hazardous, and we really need to move to a more sustainable model that uses fewer pesticides and produces more food for local consumption.
Great. We also get a lot of during legislative session, especially, there's a lot of talk about integrated pest management as what the state is already doing. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between what we're talking about, GE crops and like the heavily sprayed pesticides, and the integrated pest management system?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, integrated pest management is a concept that it's a kind of an approach to controlling pests and weeds that has been around now for 20 or 30 years, and it basically says that you need to use many different approaches to controlling pests. And the key factor is that you shouldn't rely completely on pesticides, because if you do, first of all, you're going to be using a lot of toxic compounds that can have bad effects on people and the environment. So it's good to reduce pesticide use to protect human health and the environment. And the other thing is that when you rely completely on pesticides, you get resistance, right? You get resistant bugs, you get resistant weeds, and then this leads to a pesticide treadmill effect where you're constantly, using more chemicals to try to control the resistant pests that were created by, using the other chemicals. So it's really a no-win situation, and integrated pest management was supposed to be this approach to get beyond that. And it's a good approach if it really means reducing reliance on pesticides, but unfortunately the term is now thrown around very lightly and applied to very pesticide-intensive agricultural models. One thing is completely clear: in the GE corn industry on Hawaii relies very, very heavily on pesticides. It's as far from integrated pest management as you can be. As I said, the insecticides, fungicides applied every 5 to 7 days. There's nothing even remotely sustainable about that. So, don't let yourself be fooled. Hawaii is not, at least the seed industry in Hawaii, is not practicing IPM in any way, shape, or form. Now there are folks who are, especially smaller farmers who are, reducing their reliance on pesticides, and organic producers too, and who of course don't use chemical pesticides. So that's what we need to promote.
Great. So a couple questions coming in from the audience. Could you comment on the claims that GMO crops will have the higher yields needed to feed the world? GMO crops versus organic also.
Yeah, boy, I should have mentioned that. That's been put out there now for 10 or 20 years, and it's simply not true. I mean, and one of the major genetically engineered crops is Roundup Ready soybeans, and that's Monsanto's soybeans that are sprayed with Roundup. And a lot of studies show it even gets lower yields than conventionally grown soybeans. There's a recent report by the National Academy of Sciences, which really looked closely at all of these claims about increased yield and feeding the world with GMOs, and they found that no, there's no evidence to support this. And the reason is simple: these crops are not designed to yield more. They're designed to either resist herbicides, right, or to resist insect pests. What is true is that over the years that we've had GMOs since the mid-90s, these very companies that do genetic engineering, they've continued to do conventional breeding that increases yields, right? But that's something that we've had now for 50, 60, 70 years, breeding crops conventionally to yield more, all right? Genetic engineering does not increase yields, and again, this is what the National Academy of Sciences says. They're not in any sense feeding the world. Another important point is that if you look at which countries grow GMOs, it's mostly the United States, Canada, and a few countries in South America, right? Argentina, Brazil. And these are all, big monocultures of corn and soybeans, mostly, also cotton. And most of these corn and soybeans, what are they used for? Well, they're either used to feed animals, right, to feed livestock in rich nations, or they're used to produce biofuels. About 30% of corn in the United States goes to make ethanol. That's not feeding anyone. So yeah, all of these claims about GMOs feeding the world, it's not supported by the science. It's simply not true. On organic, organic gets very good yields, and a lot of times organic crop yields don't come quite up to yields of conventional agriculture. And of course, it has a lot to do with the fact that, in conventional systems, you're using a lot of synthetic nitrogen and other fertilizers that cause a huge amount of harm to our waterways. A lot of this fertilizer gets washed into waterways and creates dead zones in our, for instance, in the Gulf of Mexico. So to get that, slightly higher yield, you have to use tons of chemicals, which cause lots of problems. I think the other main issue is that organic crops do get much higher yields than the yields that you find for the same crops in developing countries, right? When you go to developing countries, folks don't have the money for these expensive fertilizers. And there's a lot of research and a lot of efforts to promote organics in developing countries. And in most cases, organic agriculture can be a big improvement for these people in developing countries because they can get higher yields than the methods they're using now, and because they don't cost as much. You don't have to buy all of these pesticides and fertilizers that go with them. And of course, in developing countries, people don't have a lot of money. So, the truth is exactly the opposite. Organic can actually do a much better job of, helping poor folks in developing countries feed themselves.
And to that end, can we trust that certified organic crops are really safe? Do we have to worry about cross-contamination from drift, for instance?
Obviously, in today's world, especially in the United States, about 90% or more of our corn and soybeans and cotton are genetically engineered. But organic is still by far the safest option. Again, because you're not directly spraying these herbicides on the crops, and studies have shown, actually there are some really good studies that show that kids that were fed, were eating conventional produce, okay? When they were switched to a diet of organic produce, the levels of pesticide residues, metabolites in their urine declined dramatically. And this, I think they were looking especially at these really nasty organophosphate insecticides. So what that shows very clearly is that eating organic, and this is especially organic produce, is much healthier. You can't say 100% that you'll never be exposed to, some contamination, transgenic, or from pesticide drift, but far safer than crops grown conventionally or with biotech agriculture.
So on that same train of thought, can you make a comparison between organic pesticides and synthetic toxic pesticides, some of which are restricted use pesticides? Like what actually constitutes an organic pesticide, I guess is the question.
Yeah, the organic rules prohibit synthetic pesticides. So, basically these are the pesticides that are used in such huge quantities in conventional agriculture. And they're synthesized, which means that, they're created in factories, and they're often, one of the key characteristics of these synthetic pesticides is that they're often longer lasting, longer lived than their than organic pesticides, which tend, as a rule, to break down more quickly. So, for instance, there's a class of insecticides called pyrethrins, and the organic growers can use these, the natural form of these pyrethrins, which do have some toxicity. But on the positive side, they tend to break down quite quickly compared to the synthetic forms, pyrethroids, that are used by conventional growers. So, organic, first of all, it uses far smaller volumes of pesticides, and the pesticides that are used tend to be, as a rule, safer than the synthetic pesticides used in conventional agriculture.
Great, that's really clear. Thanks. And thanks to everyone for your really great questions. A couple more and then we'll wrap up. A question from James. Where is the largest hole in the screening and testing process, assuming at the EPA level? And is something being done to address it, or is there a more specific action that's needed?
Wow, yeah, that's a good question, and kind of a big one. And I will say, I think one of the key issues at EPA is how EPA, in the great majority of cases, does not take any sort of serious look at independent studies on pesticides, okay? Studies done by independent scientists. They rely almost completely on, these rote studies that are done by the industry. That's a very, very serious concern. And, especially in an area like epidemiology, and this is when, scientists go out and they, go to a farming population and they find out, what pesticides have you been using, all right? And they take detailed surveys to find out. And then they follow these farmers and see what diseases they have. And they're able to, establish associations. If certain pesticides are used, you can have an increased incidence of certain diseases. And so, I was talking before about glyphosate, and glyphosate has been very strongly associated with this cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, an immune system cancer. For the most part, EPA does not take these studies seriously. It looks only at, rat studies where, animals are fed the compound. And again, the studies are almost all done by the pesticide industry. So I think that's the biggest issue. We need more independent science, and also EPA needs to deal with the toxicity of pesticide formulations, right? Which can have additional ingredients beyond the active ingredient that are toxic. Instead, it only looks at these studies on, the active ingredient alone.
Nice. Okay, that's clear. If you could go back a couple slides, there's a chart showing increased seed crops, and there was in this the sudden peak in 1999 of fruit and vegetable crops growing, and a decline, and then a significant decline. Do you have any ideas as to why that occurred?
Yeah, I can't explain that peak in particular. This is all from data that's, the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. And I'm not sure about the big decline, which is also really concerning. I do know that the fruits part of that's the green portion on top, that's part of the decline. And we know that the portion of fresh fruits, right, that are consumed in Hawaii, okay, the portion of fresh fruits that are consumed in Hawaii that are produced locally has gone down quite a bit over those same years. So basically that means that, there's more imports of fruits and less production in Hawaii to meet Hawaii needs. And I find that particularly troubling given that Hawaii is this, basically a paradise for fruits, right? I mean, you have so many wonderful, fruits in Hawaii, and I would hope that the Hawaii Department of Agriculture would do more to, help growers who want to produce for local consumption really do that. Hawaii Department of Agriculture has an official goal of food security, but it doesn't really seem to be promoting it the way it should.
All right, one last question. This is about ingesting GMO ingredients and pesticides. So GM corn is bred to develop its own poison to kill earworms. A question from David. This poison is inherent in the corn kernels and cannot be removed. Does that mean that when we consume that corn, we're essentially ingesting that poison, that pesticide?
Yeah, that refers to these insect-resistant crops, and again, they're often called BT corn, and is perfectly right. The corn is genetically engineered to produce an insecticidal toxin, and there are real concerns, and I dealt with this many years ago. There are a lot of concerns that these toxins can cause food allergies. And, that question, EPA looked at it briefly. This was around the year 2000. There was actually one of these types of BT corn called Starlink, which EPA specifically refused to approve for human consumption. And the reason was that some of the nation's leading food allergists had told EPA, no, you shouldn't approve this for humans because this particular toxin could cause allergies in people. So EPA foolishly approved it just for animal feed use, right, or for biofuels production. But what happened, as you can imagine, is that the corn got into the human food supply in a big way, right? You just can't keep corn for animals and corn for people separate. And there are a number of people who believe that they had allergic reactions because of that corn. And unfortunately, there was an investigation, and it was never satisfactorily, demonstrated whether that was true or not. And it's one of these issues where you need to be much more stringent up front and vet these crops much more carefully and not put them out there before they've been properly tested. Because once they're out in the food supply, it's incredibly difficult to track, any health harms they might have. And the reason is because we all eat a lot of different types of food, and it can be really difficult to pinpoint if you're feeling sick after you eat something, what it's due to. One reason that GMO labeling is important is that it could give at least some guidance as to, well, if I do get sick eating food and it did have GMOs, could that possibly be, part of what's going on, so that would be one important reason to have GMO labeling.
Great. Thanks, Bill. All right, well, we'll end on that note. If you could go to that last slide, Bill, that would be great. I really want to thank you for sharing with us today. Bill's been working on these issues specifically in Hawaii for 15 years now, and I know me personally, I'm incredibly grateful for your expertise and taking the time to really understand these issues and share with us today. It was incredibly helpful. So thank you to Bill and thank you to everyone for joining us. We are going to be sharing this webinar with you via email, so keep an eye out for that and share it with those that you think would be interested. If you can, check out our protectourkeiki.org website, where we'll have information on the legislation that we're working on this session. We are going to be pushing for state level bills on buffer zones and pesticide disclosure and notification. So please take a look at that and testify and come in person and meet with your legislators and tell them how important these issues are to you. That makes a huge difference. So we'll keep you updated on that, on Protect Our Keiki on our Facebook page. You can join our membership. If you want to get the full FAQs and get the answers on paper, go to the website here, cfs.center/high pesticide FAQs. All the information is there, along with memes and other shareable images you can use to spread the word to your friends. So if you have any other questions, this is my email. Feel free to reach out. If not, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.